Welcome to the Not Work Storytelling Podcast. This is the show where we untangle our myths and reweave our stories, one ancient tale at a time. I'm your host, Marisa Gowdy. I'm a word witch, a writing coach, a story healer, and the author of The Sovereignty Knot, A Woman's Way to Freedom, Power, Love, and Magic. Mythology and folklore are medicine for the modern soul. Let's hear today's story and explore why it still matters. Before we dive into this week's episode, I'd like to tell you about Storyweaver Book Coaching. This is support for memoirists, thought leaders, and creative entrepreneurs at the beginning of their writing journey. You've got stories to tell. You feel like you've got a book inside of you. Before you can weave your visions into the chapters and birth this book into the world, you've got a lot of untangling and imagining to do. And that's where I come in. I can help you explore your personal experiences, get clear on your big ideas, and get clarity on what makes your book unique and compelling. I'm here as a sounding board and a thought partner. I'll ask tough questions and also give you a safe space to land. When it's time to start putting words on the page, I can be your trusted first set of eyes, and we can begin to craft your manuscript together. Learn more over at my website, marisagowdy.com. Let's talk and see if Storyweaver Book Coaching might be just what you're looking for. Season 2, Episode 13, Mysteries and Holy Wells, 3 stories of healing and the quest for a cure. Our guest is Elizabeth Stack. Elizabeth is the Executive Director of the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, New York. Previously, she taught Irish and Irish American history and was an Associate Director of the Institute of Irish Studies at Fordham. She completed her PhD at Fordham, writing about Irish and German immigrants in New York at the turn of the 20th century, as they grappled with the immigration restriction movements of that time. She has a master's degree in Anglo-Irish Relations in the 20th century from University College Dublin. A native of Listowel in County Kerry, Elizabeth sees a huge connection between her own experience as an immigrant — she moved to the U.S. in 2009 — with the important mission of the museum to preserve and share Irish heritage and culture. I am so excited to welcome Elizabeth Stack to the podcast today. As is our way at Not Work Storytelling, we ask the stories to speak for themselves, and then we'll talk about how they resonate and why they still matter. So, Elizabeth, will you tell us a story?
I will. Well, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, or 3, I think, stories, but it's all to do with illness and the practice of illness and cures. So holy wells, as you probably know, are very popular in Ireland, particularly in certain parts of Munster. I'm from County Kerry. The story I'm going to tell today is from a well in Tipperary. There were certainly hundreds of these wells, some of which were documented as early as the late 1700s. And in fact, legislation had been passed by the British to tear down the wells or to arrest people who leave offerings. And so it's a very funny part of Irish history and the Irish practice of Catholicism, because of course, during the penal laws, you couldn't really practice your religion, and the ordination of new priests was forbidden, all these kinds of things. And so Irish Catholicism, until after the Great Hunger, was a weird blend of pagan and what they could remember of the taught church. In fact, even, St. Patrick had come to Ireland in the 400 or 500s. We didn't have a Latin influenced church until about 200 or 300 years later. So the Irish version of Catholicism has always been a little bit more pagan or folkloric centered. And so these wells, often attached to a monastery, or often maybe had been there before the monastery was built and then the monastery subsumed it. And so people would go on what was called pattern days. And this was a big occasion for a town. It was often to honor the saint that was attached to the well. So St. Bridget or St. Patrick, but all these other very obscure wells. We have a well near us in Listowel, and supposedly it has a cure for eyes, but the saint is nobody I've ever heard of. So people would go and leave a token on the tree, maybe the piece of cloth that they used to soak in the well and bring home and cure whoever, they would bring that back. Something maybe personal. And as I say, Queen Anne actually passed legislation to prevent that from happening. But today, certainly at St. Bridget's Well in County Clare, it's near Listowel, And there's one up in her home place of Kildare too. The tree is inundated up in Kildare, like with little bits of ribbon. And there's a whole tunnel in Listowel where people have left photographs or pictures. So it's very moving and kind of magical, and this brings us back to, of course, I was saying, because we imposed religion on the Celtic and the pagan, some of these are kind of fairy practices. So the wells, you would go to the well and walk around it in what was called a round, but it was sometimes kind of linked to the rosary. People would say a certain amount of prayers in a certain pattern. You could either bathe in the water sometimes, or, as I say, fill a little vessel and take it back if somebody was too sick to travel, or sometimes drink the water. It's very interesting now that we're all obsessed with health and safety. Some of these wells have been tested, and they are actually a lot of minerals that may have helped, particularly with skin conditions. So, you'll find a lot of the wells like cured scrofula, which is they call it TB of the neck. More cynical people would say they were cured because they finally were taking a bath, because people did not tend to wash themselves very frequently. But this one particular well near Clonmel is apparently, very well dated. This was in 1914, in April of 1914. This very famous well, St. Patrick's Well, near Marlfield in Tipperary, was known to have curative powers. And John was only 13 years of age. He had hurt his leg somehow a few years ago and had surgery, which didn't really work. And then he had to have a second surgery. And you can imagine, as a young teenage boy, the pain that he was going through. He wasn't able to play with his friends, all those kinds of things. So his mother brought him to visit the well. Now, the interesting thing about his mom was she was from Tipperary town, which was maybe 30 miles away from Clonmel. She apparently had previously been cured from a different well. As a child, she had injured her finger and was going to be amputated. And her aunt sent her a jar of water from a well, and they prayed, and her finger was cured. So because the mother believed in the power of the well, it's alleged, her faith was kind of able to inspire the son and guarantee his cure. So he visited the well 3 times in August of 1912, and then he had to go back in August of 1913. And his last visit was St. Patrick's Day in 1914, these visits. And on every visit, his mother came with him, and mother and son recited 5 decades of the Rosary. And they said 7 Hail Marys in honor of St. Patrick. There was a little ruined church near the well, which is actually quite a huge well, and there's kind of a lake and a beautiful view. It's very well visited still today. And they said prayers again there before the site of the altar. And a week after his last visit on St. Patrick's Day in 1914 to St. Patrick's Well, he discarded his crutches and he was able to walk with a stick, and very soon after that was walking unaided. So his story kind of spread far and wide, and people were absolutely believing that the well had happened. Now, I should say he also had surgery on his leg, whatever was wrong with his leg. So, but it's the power that people had ascribed to these places remained very powerful. And then a very interesting thing happened in a town not too far from Clonmel, where this well is. In 1919, the War of Independence started in Ireland. Actually, funnily enough, the first shots were fired in Tipperary too, in a town called Solohabeg. But in 1920, British soldiers, technically called the Black and Tans, they were given a mixture of uniforms because the British government didn't really want to send in the army. So they didn't provide them with a full army uniform. There was a mixture between the army uniform and the police uniform. The Northamptonshire Regiment attacked Templemore, which is a town in Tipperary, because an RIC officer, one of the police officers, had been killed by the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the day before. So they come into this town kind of shooting off their guns. The Black and Tans were sort of infamous for taking their violence out on civilian population and kind of random attacks. And they set fire to a number of homes and businesses. And in that attack, ironically enough, no civilians or IRA people were killed, but 2 soldiers accidentally got trapped in the fires that they themselves had set. Now, maybe a night or two after that, a 16-year-old farm labourer, and again, it's interesting to talk about the age of these boys, a young 13-year-old to be cured in the other story, and now this 16-year-old, James Walsh, said that he was visited by the Virgin Mary in his cottage in a little village, Curraheen, outside the town. that she told him she was very troubled by what was happening in Ireland. She requested that he dig a hole in the ground in his bedroom. Of course, these mud cabins, often only did have a mud floor, and the hole filled with spring water. He claimed that he had at least one statue of the Virgin Mary, and she started to bleed tears. He took the statues into the town of Templemore, and the bleeding was witnessed. One man in the town, who had been crippled for most of his life, claimed he was dancing in the streets after visiting Walsh in his cottage. And he was the first of many who claimed that either the presence of Walsh or the statues cured them of whatever their ailments were. Now, amazingly, people started flooding into the town in the middle of this war of independence. It was sort of seen, some people say, as an act of protest, that they were asserting their Catholic identity in the face of this British opponent, that their spiritual powers would win out against the substantial worldly powers of the British Empire. And so it was reported in local and national newspapers, and more pilgrims started to come to look at these statues, which were now kind of on display. In the end of August, one of the police inspectors wrote to the Dublin Castle administration, estimating that about 15,000 pilgrims per day were coming into the town. And they nicknamed Templemore Pilgrimville. Some were coming for cures for illnesses and reported that they received them. Allegedly, one of the Royal Irish Constabulary police officer resigned from his job to join a religious order, and allegedly one of the soldiers was reported to convert to Catholicism. So there was this huge economic windfall for the town, but the church remained cautious. The official position was, quote, extreme reserve. The parish priest was a man called Kiley, and he refused to go down, and look at the statues or even to kind of bless them. But nobody tried to stop the pilgrims from coming. The priest said, if it's a prank, it will fizzle out. And if not, why should I stop it? So the IRA commander, James Leahy, noted that the older church were more skeptical of this young boy, Walsh, who claimed to have, had this Marian apparition. But the younger clergy were very enthusiastic about his claims. So one of the statues, there was 3 statues involved. One of them was given to one of the local police constables named Winsey, and he put the statue in the barracks, kind of on display. I'm not sure if he was displaying it or kind of had he taken it away so that the power would be cut. But in fact, a lot of the RIC, these policemen, were Catholic Irish. It was a job that people did back in the day. So these were not like foreign British soldiers occupying. So this statue that they put in the barracks was said to be bleeding as well. And in fact, pilgrims tried to siege the police station to get in to enter it. So they had to remove the statue from there and put it on display in a public order. And so eventually the IRA kind of take over, because they have to organize the traffic and help the pilgrims and basically keep order. They did not appear in uniform in the streets. So it was kind of an undercover IRA. But neither were they arrested by the Crown forces, which is kind of impressive because this is in the height of the violent year. 1920 was a very violent year for the IRA. So the IRA commander, James Leahy, imposed a levy on traffic that was coming into the town. They raised donations, and all of this money went to the IRA, apparently, to help them buy arms. So, now maybe we're seeing the origin of the story. But, they kept order in the town. He apparently reached out to the director of IRA intelligence, Michael Collins, and there was a little bit of back and forth apparently up in Dublin about what to do with this. Should we allow these kind of pilgrims to keep going? And apparently Michael Collins kind of dismissed somebody who was very non-believing. And he said, well, one can't take any notice of what you say because you have no religion. So, Michael Collins tacitly let it go. So unfortunately, the war did start up again. Soldiers were attacked, 2 constables were killed. The town was maybe going to be attacked. So Walsh's cottage had to be emptied out. The statues were taken back. In fact, one of them was gone up to Dublin. And apparently, when Michael Collins got his hands on one of the statues, it had been rigged internally with a fountain pen insert. And there was kind of an alarm clock set up. And so at certain times, this fake blood, whether it was ink or animal blood, would come out. So nobody knows if James Walsh was a spy. Had he done this at the request of the IRA? He ended up leaving Tipperary and actually going to Australia and lived there for the rest of his life, never returned to Ireland. So no one is sure if it was like a prank from this 16-year-old boy that got out of hand, or was it a money-making operation in the name of the IRA? Although most people admit the IRA had probably nothing to do with it to begin with, that they were able to sort of take over in the end. But there's a book was written recently about this called the Templemore Miracles. And it's so interesting to me that, in the middle of a war, for a couple of days and weeks at least, this town finally saw peace. And so you wonder, what was going through the head of that 16-year-old boy when he said he had his vision, Which then brings us to my last story, which is set in Limerick. And I think it kind of just encapsulates all of these things that we've been talking about, the poverty of people, and it's to do with my grandmother. And of course, Ireland by now in 1920, I alleged earlier on that religion was not a huge part of Irish life until after the Great Hunger. And so people had now had what was called the devotional revolution. There was a lot of discipline imposed on people and how they practiced their religion. The anti-Catholic laws had been repealed in 1836, but the famine was so devastating to the population and the demographics that it took a long time before that could kind of be re-established. So, you'll see a huge amount of church building going on in Ireland in the 1840s and the 1850s, despite the Great Hunger. So my grandmother was born in 1921, which again was the beginning of the War of Independence. And her father had been in the American Merchant Marine. They had 11 children in a small, tiny house in Clare Street in Limerick, which was very close to the convent of the Good Shepherd, which, for those of you who know, was one of the Magdalene homes. It was, the mother and baby homes. So my grandmother had all kinds of stories about that growing up across the street from that. She said one day they were going to a dance when she was about 17 and a girl escaped from the convent and tried to jump in. They must have been in, a pony and trap or some kind of conveyance. And a kind of a groundskeeper guy came running after her and grabbed her from them and basically whipped her all the way back up the street. So by this time, in the early 30s, people were very afraid of the church, and the parish priest was a very powerful figure. They passed a law in, I think it was 1935, that banned dance halls and dancing at the crossroads and things, which was a very, very integral part of Irish cultural life, particularly in rural communities. Where I grew up in Kerry, the practice is back now, thank God, in the summer months. But like to dance at the crossroads was sort of innocent. I think the priests were always afraid of people courting and all these things. So my grandmother's story is her sibling got very ill. And it's interesting, again, what people don't tell you or what they didn't know themselves at the time, how they can't explain their own story. My grandmother was told when she was a child, and she told me, that her sister hit her hip on the desk at school and she had a really big bruise. And suddenly, a week later, she's dying in hospital. So it sounds like it might have been sepsis or something. Undoubtedly, I think my grandmother's family were much poorer than we were made aware of. And, certainly, thank God, we didn't grow up with that level of poverty. But I remember when Angela's ashes came out, my grandmother was so mad because it felt like somebody was telling secrets from the family. And she absolutely denied it, that nobody could be that poor and Limerick was not that bad. And she absolutely detested the book. And I think it was because it touched a raw part for her, So one night she was visiting her sister in hospital. I doubt if it was in the convent across the street from them, because I don't think they had a hospital necessarily. So it was probably Barrington's or one of the other hospitals. But my grandmother, they were taking it in turns. I'm not sure, if my grandfather would have been away or my great-grandfather would have been away for work at the time or not. But apparently the siblings were taking it in turns to stay with Philly, her younger sister. And she was nicknamed Philly Drumstick because she had a gap in her teeth. Well, that's not why she was called Drumstick. Sorry. She had a gap in her teeth. I only know two things about her. She had a gap in her teeth that she could whistle through. And she loved what was called like a drumstick. It was a penny toffee or something that they could buy at the local store. So they obviously didn't get these treats very often, but she loved them enough that they called her Philly drumstick, because of this toffee. So my grandmother was with her the night before she died. And again, like, I don't even really know what she died of, or I think she was about 9, and my grandmother was probably 10 and a little bit. And Philly said to her, Sally, my grandmother's name was Sarah, Sally, I'm scared. Will you come into bed with me? And my grandmother lay on the bed next to her. And of course, they lived in a 2 or 3 bedroomed house, these 11 kids. So they absolutely shared beds in their own house all the time. And for any of you who sleep next to somebody when they're not in the bed, you feel they're lost, And so my grandmother got alongside her in the bed and was holding her hands, and a nun came in and absolutely gave out sugar to her because she hadn't taken her shoes off, and how dare she get on the bed, and sent her home. And Philly died that night on her own. So it's this heartbreaking story of like the powerlessness in the face of illness, an illness that you can't even name or describe or diagnose. And, who knows, maybe her parents knew and they just didn't tell her, but also the kind of fear of the church. And I think my trinity of stories show almost the evolution, but it's a devolution in a way, that these unstructured cures that happened at Wells for years, for centuries, that people had so much faith in them, and that it was encouraged, as I say, by the local monastery or whoever was attached. And then this kind of period in the middle in 1920, when Republican Ireland was rising and they were gaining independence, and for a brief moment, this use of the Catholic religion and the belief in the religion helped one town at least find peace for a little while. And then by the 30s, the power had gone so much to the structure of the church that the humanity was totally gone out of it. And so you think of Patrick, this 14-year-old boy who was able to bathe in the water and kick off his crutches, to, a 9-year-old girl 15, 20 years later, not being allowed, sleep with her sister in the bed in a hospital because it's not what you do. So the propriety of things had totally dehumanized people's experiences.
Oh, wow. Elizabeth, it strikes me that we're going to be releasing this in October. We're at a time when we think about spirits, we think about, with Samhain coming, with Hallows Eve, as well as thinking about whether or not what happened in 1920 was a prank, which is a little bit of Halloween in there too. But in thinking about Philly Drumstick, she would have been just about 100 right now, right? And that we have this opportunity to remember a life that ended entirely too soon. Thank you for bringing her to us.
Well, it's so sad, I think, that my grandmother died in 2004, and you always say, she told us these stories again and again, and sometimes you'd kind of get bored, like, oh, not the Philly drumstick story, and now that we don't have her, that we can't clarify those details, it's kind of heartbreaking, because all of her siblings are dead. And I know some of my mom's cousins, might know more of the story because they stayed in Limerick. My grandmother married a Kerryman and moved down to Kerry. So I'm sure like people in the family know a little bit more of the detail, or were more curious. My grandmother,
right,
I think, chose to not dwell on the past, even though she told us those stories, she didn't ever like interrogate her own memories of it, or, she was never, oh, I wonder what Philly did have, like, it sounds weird that you would die from banging your hip, she never wanted to question it.
Right.
And of course, as your podcast and us as Irish people, stories are so important to us, and to fill in those gaps. Or so when you have a half told story, it's this kind of niggling thing that you can't ever really be satisfied with, because there's more to the story.
Right. And I just imagine your grandmother as, an 11-year-old girl, probably mortally terrified she might go bump her hip, I mean,
absolutely.
And how much trauma gets buried in there to say, opening that box up to tell it as a story.
Yeah.
It would be entirely too hard, especially knowing what her reaction would have been to Angela's ashes and Frank McCourt's work. Like, there was a lot there that she just wasn't ready to wrap up in a tale she could tell grandchildren.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's like she never spared us. Her stories were, looking back now, very harsh, like because she did live opposite that convent.
Yeah.
And, she told me her best friend lived next door. They were Clancy's as well, but no relation apparently. And Rita Clancy's father was widowed and he married again very quickly, as Irish men, tended to do. And of course, very stereotypical, stepmother, wicked stepmother. Rita Clancy had beautiful hair, and apparently her stepmother was jealous of her, and the mother cut her hair. But now you're thinking, like, TB was rampant in Ireland at those times. They cut your hair often for fevers or lice, or
Right.
and you wonder if there was a health reason behind the cutting of the hair that my grandmother never knew or didn't appreciate. But all of her stories were just, I mean, some of them were funny and they had great times. She was very close to all of her siblings. There was always a kind of a just wait because something might happen. There was a kind of a darkness that they lived with, I think, that is thankfully gone from a lot of Irish homes. But yeah, as you say, her own, like she retained definitely like a very strong faith, not necessarily in religion. She didn't go to church, which was funny. Like she would watch mass on TV or listen to it on the radio, but she believed like in Padre Pio. She had a little card of his. She believed in Saint Teresa. It was very funny. Like she loved the pagan symbology behind, religion all her life, but not necessarily the structure of the church.
Well, that's what mystics do, right? Is they find that the mystery and the magic within that offers that spark, which really escapes the structure of sitting in the harsh pews and going through. And having lived across from a Magdalen laundry would certainly get you thinking, I want to stay as far away from those straight lines and angles and prison cells as I possibly could.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and when I was 9, my mother had a baby, and of course, you're running around like a little mother hen. And my grandmother lived with us sometimes, and I stupidly, like my mother asked me to warm her bottle, and usually you would put the bottle into a jug and pour the boiling water into the jug. And I just was like not thinking. I had done this, 100 times. So I held the bottle in my hand and poured the boiling water over my hand straight from the kettle. And I was crying. My hand was red. It was not blistered, but very, very sore. And I went to bed. They put Sudocrem, which is just like lavender. It's not medicinal. They put Sudocrem on my hand, and I went to bed with my hand absolutely throbbing. And I woke up the next morning with not a mark on my hand, no pain. And I said to my God, my hand, I thought we'd have to go to the doctor today, and my grandmother said, oh, I rubbed it with Padre Pio's relic. And, it's one of these things that I sometimes kind of think, did it even happen to me? Because, I wasn't aware of it. I was asleep at night, but her faith was so strong, and I mean, maybe it wasn't 3rd-degree burns, it was just boiling water. But at the same time, there was, for me, as a 9 or 10-year-old, there absolutely was an element of, ooh, like I've magically been cured,
Yes, absolutely. Well, speaking of the holy water, though one can't see us, you can see that I'm holding up this little jar right here, which is water from Liscannor, from the Bridget's Wells.
St. Bridget, isn't it beautiful?
Yes. Yeah. And I grew up with a French Canadian grandmother, and my mother had the Irish in her from my grandfather's side. But in that similar way, there was always a little holy water around somewhere, and it was a quiet thing that you just knew it was nearby.
Yeah.
Memories of the French Canadian priests in my family blessing our cars when we drive up to Canada. And sprinkling. And that, that was the 80s, and it felt like another world then. Oh, they must only do that in Canada. Well, no, they must only do that when they're a priest born in the 20s, right?
Yeah. I think, a lot of people would still have those kind of, I was going to say superstitions, but you would still bless a journey or people. Absolutely. I think a lot of people that fly, are quite nervous. And I must admit, I say a prayer every landing and takeoff,
Yeah. Right. So tracing the amount of change that you offer us within 20 years, which kind of encapsulates a bigger change. And I really, as much as I've been a student of Irish literature and history for so long, I think in some ways I really missed that sense of it really wasn't till the middle of the 19th century when this sort of crystallized vision of Irish Catholicism came into place, because it became so much a part of the country's identity, especially from looking at it from the outside as a member of the diaspora, as an American, looking back and saying, oh my goodness, Irish Catholic, Ireland, all the kids go to Catholic school. It all must have always been this way.
Yeah. And it's not, that's a very interesting point, Marisa. And actually, it's almost the opposite. I would think, to be honest, that particularly a guy like the Archbishop John Hughes, Dagger John, that founded Fordham University and the Immigrant Savings Bank, it was actually Irish America, I think, who kind of superimposed the sort of middle class values, because Catholics had experienced a lot of negativity when they come to America. And I think we forget that, actually. We're very proudly Irish today, and everybody wants to be Irish on St. Patrick's Day, and you forget that there was this massive anti-Catholic nativism in the 1830s through the 1850s, where churches were burned and all of those nasty cartoons right into the 1870s and 80s, that it was really thought that Irish Catholic immigrants could not become good American citizens because they did not know how to be small or Republicans. They owed their allegiance to the Pope. So there's two things going on. You have the devotional revolution happening at home, but you have a kind of a similar revolution happening here in New York, where particularly John Hughes in New York or other leaders throughout the country were adamant that Irish Americans prove themselves to be good citizens by adhering to the rules of the church, but also by adhering to the civil rules, and so I find that kind of fascinating that all of this is springing up. And then in Ireland is becoming much, much stricter in the 20th century in independence. So, we have our Taoiseach, which Prime Minister at the time, Eamon de Valera, very Catholic, very insular, wanting to kind of eschew any progressive outward looking, like he's everything that Ireland needed to succeed it had within itself. So as I say, they banned the crossroads dancing. There's no kind of investment in anything. And for a long time, it was the greatest honor of your life, if you had a child who grew up to become a nun or a priest. And every family hoped that one child would have a vocation, both in Irish America and I think at home. And then all of a sudden, Ireland, in the last 20 years has kind of outpaced Irish America in terms of, we've had all of these reports, 3 different reports on clerical abuse in Ireland, whether it is through, the schools and orphanages and things. So mass attendance is way back. We don't even have priests really, so priests are sharing parishes or they're having to bring in priests from outside, which is incredible considering Irish people were ministers, across the world. So we've had weird kind of reckoning. Our prime minister, the last prime minister we had was gay. We've had a very progressive, I think, outlook. We voted as a country, the only one in the world to democratically vote for same-sex marriage. So Irish Catholics are kind of gone back to their semi-pagan roots in a way, I think, where it's a more welcoming and a less formal, less structured church. People like the tradition, I think, of church. I know several people who have married within the church and they baptize their kids, but they're not necessarily daily communicants by any means or going to church even on a Sunday. And I think they're happy with the ritual and tradition, and they're happy with their spirituality and faith as it is without the need to practice Catholicism. So I think that has been a very interesting journey to watch, while I've lived in Ireland and then moved here to see how Catholic Irish America can be at times. It's kind of interesting.
Well, where you and I most recently met was at the Irish Echoes campfire event. And it was very interesting. That diversity was definitely part of the focus of the day. We recently had Christian Bolden on the podcast, who spoke as a member of the African American Irish Diaspora Network. He's on the board. Yes. But diversity was certainly coming up also just within the ranks of what might be seen as more traditional Irish America, white Irish America, in thinking about the ancient order of Hibernian side of things that would be very much looking to the Catholic side of tradition in that certain way. And it was very clear at the event too. It's like, this is a pro-choice marriage equality country that everyone's looking back to.
Yeah.
And when I really recognize, I studied in Ireland 20 years ago now. When I went to Ireland, I was one of those American girls searching out the goddess inside the Marian
Yeah.
shrines. I was inspired by the poetry of Nuala Nagonal because that's where you could find the goddess. And then you'd reach
Hmm.
back into the mythology
Hmm.
and found friends and comrades in that. But now I'm noticing even more. It's that sense of, as the folkloric aspect of the faith, as the
Hmm.
it's interesting. Tradition is such a difficult and nuanced word, but going back to, as you're describing, what, that Celtic Christianity perspective,
Hmm.
I know I've seen it just in the last 20 years of watching. It feels like a lot of the ways, what I had been looking for in Ireland and found in the land is coming up more and more in the culture and in the conversation, perhaps
Hmm.
as religion shifts.
I think absolutely. Ireland was a weird country, I think in the 20th century. And just from a historian's point of view, even, we have a strangely matriarchal society in lots of ways, although a very patriarchal form of government, particularly in independence with De Valera. And so, like, women had been at the forefront of, like, the Common Man movement, during the 1916 Rising. He always sidelined them. He wouldn't allow women to fight. In his 1916 barracks, when he took over, Countess Markievicz led another battalion. There was hundreds of women who were volunteers, but he thought they should be little nurses. And so it was interesting to watch, like, that all of these Scatha and Aoife were two warriors who trained Cuchulainn, back in the day. So we've had the Bridget, our goddess, and they're finally kind of making as much of our matron saint as we do of our patron saint. So it was this weird dichotomy in Ireland that women, on the one hand, a mother in the family, the husband might come home and give her his paycheck. She very much ran the house and the household. She gave the husband an allowance, and not in every family, of course, but legally, a married woman could not work for the state. They weren't entitled to a pension. I mean, similar to in America, women couldn't get credit cards in their own name. So it's very strange, that socially and maybe culturally, privately, we were matriarchal, but everything official seemed to suggest we were not. And so, and I do think once all those convents closed and those stories came out, it was very difficult to stand in control of something that you couldn't defend as an institution.
Right, right. I'm wondering if I can draw a good parallel here because I don't want to essentialize femininity and the matriarchy and healing, but it's very
Mm.
interesting to think about. We're here to tell stories of healing. We're thinking about the use of the holy water. And
Mm-hmm.
then we start discussing the different roles of women. We start discussing the
Mm-hmm.
different ways that femininity and the matriarchy come to the fore. And it's so interesting. It's almost just cycles or waves of this crest and then this repression, this sense of we're
Mm-hmm.
going to go back to these ancient remedies. And then there's
Mm-hmm.
going to be a new way in which, oh no, we need to trust in what the priest says. We need to trust in what modern medicine is. It just feels like it
Mm-hmm.
just underlines something that I think we almost know intuitively and certainly can trace historically as well as this sense of where is the matriarchal and the patriarchal, the breathe in and the breathe out.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it seems to constantly be shifting and in relationship, which I suppose is the nature of life.
Yeah, but it's a pity that it's not more in balance.
Yeah.
That it seems like one has to be on top instead of the other, and I think it probably won't be completely effective or completely sustainable unless it's in balance.
Yes.
And I mean, we just talked about Saint Bridget, who was probably a goddess or a pagan. These stories get used because she was so powerful a figure that they couldn't not have her.
Yeah.
But she was a healer in her own lifetime. I mean, we know she existed, and her monastery was bisexual. She allowed men and women,
Right.
so it wasn't segregated, is what I'm saying.
Right. Right.
And maybe she was the most correct kind of all of the paths because she didn't discriminate. She absolutely was inclusive. She was the patron saint of brewers and farmers, and and disfigured her beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget, because she didn't want to be given away in marriage. And so but it's all these sacrifices that women have to make to be acceptable. Or there's just so much, I think, going on in Irish history and in Irish culture that there's a secret awareness, I think, of we have a guy coming to give a lecture, Dr. Andrew Snedden from, I think, University in Ulster. The funny thing about, because we're talking about Halloween, the witchcraft phase never really made it to Ireland. There was a couple of trials up in the north of Ireland in the Protestant community. And I think it's so fascinating. His work has kind of shown that Irish people accepted witches.
Right.
Because we have had them forever. So we weren't panicked in the 1600s, because a witch was kind of a wise woman.
Mm-hmm.
When medicine started to become professionalized and men take over, particularly around issues of childbirth and stuff, women knew how to rid yourself of an unwanted pregnancy through herbs and things. And so, I mean, who wants to give birth lying down? Thankfully, I've never given birth, so I don't know. But it stands to no common sense that you would lie down.
Gravity is absolutely essential. I will speak from experience.
Yeah. And so when women did it, you had a birthing stool, but you had to lie down because it was eye level for the doctor while he was seated. And so It's amazing, like what the little common sense things that we lost through this professionalization.
Right.
And so Andrew's work, I think, is so fascinating because there's a couple of witch trials. Alice Kittler was killed in the 1300s, and that's a kind of a different thing. But he says because Catholics absolutely do not buy into demonic possession of the woman. They believe that a woman can have certain powers, that maybe she's a changeling, maybe she's a fairy, and let her go on about her business. So we don't have the witch hunts that are present in other communities, which I think is so fantastic for us in one way,
Absolutely. Yes. Let the Bonfassa, the wise woman, do her work at the hut at the end of the lane, right? If Biddy Early had her bottles.
Exactly. And if she's a mischievous one, you had ways to protect yourself against that. You could put a charm on the thing yourself, or you could get the priest to bless it. So people felt sufficiently protected against the potential negativity of a witch, negativity of a witch, which I think is just fascinating,
Well, they had a holy well down the lane, and if they wanted to be protected, they would just grab a bottle of their own, right?
Yeah. Or, as simple as leaving bread out as an offering, or not throwing your water out the front door so that you didn't annoy the fairies passing by, little things like that everyone knew how to live in harmony with an entity that could potentially hurt you or potentially do you a favor, So it's that balance.
Yeah. Just to kind of offer, well, it's a plug for a previous Not Work Storytelling episode, but that really speaks to this essence of balance and refers to Bridget. Laura Murphy, who's the poet in residence for Herstory, Ireland, was on the podcast earlier this season, and she came and told a story of the goddess Bowen. And for her, the real essence of this story is finding that balance between, as she would give it in this story about the divine masculine and the divine feminine, but just that whole essence of, as you described it in Bridget's work too, when, her monastery was open to all because the segregation and separation out of fear of sexuality and all the other things that caused that to happen. She offered another way because she was the goddess of childbirth and gave us the anvil to go and craft things from there.
Wow.
Yeah. So, just all of these overlaps and how they just keep weaving around. Elizabeth, I'm so grateful to you for just bringing us so much. We could go on all day. I feel like I still want to just linger with you at the crossroads and see who else appears, because all of the stories just they come together and create, obviously, why this not just national but global fascination with Ireland, with Irish culture, with Irish story touches so many of us.
Yeah, and I think it's very organic. I remember reading Sue Monk, Kids Traveling with Pomegranates. It's an amazing book, and she talks about her search for the divine feminine, and it was so. I think if you're just still, sometimes these things do come because there must be a memory, a psychic memory down through the generations. And so even though my grandmother's stories are sometimes not fully there, sometimes there's, as John O'Donoghue says, there's presence in the absence too. And so those gaps are important.
Yes.
Even though they're tragic.
Right. Even though the evil stepmother next door had to become something out of a fairy tale, that allowed you to be told that story, to remember, to then wonder about what was really going on besides just one, archetypal stepmother cruelty. what else was happening in Limerick at that
Mm-hmm.
moment? What else did she live
Mm-hmm.
through?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Well, I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about the Irish American Heritage Museum. I feel like we've touched on a bit of that, but can you tell our listeners a little bit more about the museum and your work there?
Sure. Well, it's 35 years, imagine now, the museum, founded in East Durham, originally kind of as a seasonal little operation. And then we moved to Albany about 10 or 12 years ago, and I took over in 2018. So we have evolved. The whole, I think, thing seems to be evolution today. And we're basically, the mission of the museum is to share the stories of the Irish in America and the contributions. And that has become more and more complex. You know, we spoke a little bit earlier on about diversity, the day of the Irish Echo campfire. And in fact, we had Lenny Sloan and Mick Maloney here a couple of weeks before that. And 36% of African Americans have Irish ancestry, imagine. And so our community is more diverse than we think. Mm-hmm. And we give a lot of talks here at the museum. Most of them are live streamed on YouTube, so you can check out our YouTube channel, because the museum itself is quite small. You know, it's mostly reading, like there's not a whole pile of artifacts to look at. But the longer I sit here trying to formulate how to tell the story and what stories to tell, we've included a lot more women, of course, in the stories. But the interesting thing about it too is how like other people our story is. And so, because sometimes Irish America tends to get a little bit political about things, you know, if you talk about the Great Hunger, they're immediately, oh no, it was genocide. No Irish historian calls that period genocide. It may be for semantic reasons, because there's a strict legal definition of genocide that period just does not fit. This was how the government dealt with poor people in England. Irish people treated other Irish people horrifically. It was the failure of one crop, which unfortunately a very overpopulated country was dependent on, you know. But at the same time, it's a very complex, and you can't boil it down to just genocide, for instance. But then at the same token, a lot of Irish Americans are very anti-immigration today. And so, you know, you kind of can't hold both ideas, I think, in your head at the same time. You know, that just recently when we saw those refugees, not illegal immigrants, but literally refugees, being transported from one state to another without their knowledge or approval or without the correct paperwork. We still talk about the Great Hunger, people dying on coffin ships 160 years ago, and we don't see the parallel, you know.
Right.
So that's kind of, without getting political about it, that's the mission of the museum, to try to create empathy, that if our story is worth telling 175 years ago, and it is the 175th anniversary of Black 47, the worst year of the Great Hunger, if our story is relevant today from back then the fact that it's still happening today to other people should also move us.
Right.
And I see that as being more and more the mission of the museum, that we're not kind of putting up shrines to some misremembered past without saying what's happening currently too.
Right. And it just really underlines how much empathy and storytelling and education are intended to inform politics. And that is not a political statement. It is a sense of, let's all sit and look back at various perspectives, at well-researched perspectives, and listen to human stories told in the past and in the moment. That's the only way we change the world for the better, not with another slogan.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, you know, if you can feel sorry for your ancestors, you know, that, oh my God, nearly died on a coffin ship and walked down from Montreal, then you can feel sorry for migrants walking from Venezuela today. Right. And so I think those stories are so important, and it's not to take from the suffering, you know, or to take from the delight that we have that we survived all of that, but it's so important to, as you say, like, do something with the story. You know, you have to be able to internalize it and understand what it means.
Right.
And definitely, even as a museum, you know, we don't want to be dusty relics in glass cases that nobody can touch. You know, it is more about reaching people, you know. So I'm very proud of the work we're doing, and, you know, we're getting bigger and better. COVID was a mixed blessing. I think we panicked initially because we were a bricks and mortar institution that had to close its doors, you know. They say 30% of New York museums will not reopen. Wow. So these little entities and house museums, that kind of thing, that's a lot of material culture to lose, and a lot of stories and memories to lose. And we had to adapt, and we adapted by telling the stories literally instead of on the walls. And so, we have a huge program for October, to be honest, and right through the year. And there's over, 100 and something videos on our YouTube channels of other topics. So, I encourage everybody to look it up.
Yes, I'm happy to share those links. And I just want to, as a plug for how much I enjoyed going to the museum, I brought my 12-year-old daughter to see Mancan Magan's Aran Agus Im. And certainly he's somebody who's making Irish language and culture come alive in all new ways that are yet so ancient, and just such a wonderful thing to be able to drive up an hour from New Paltz up to Albany to see you.
Yeah.
So look forward to seeing
it was great. And Mancan's was amazing. That the language and relationship to the land, that if we lose that, I was fascinated by his work, because he was talking about the Irish had how many words for milking cows and for the sound of a cow bereft of her calf. Yeah. And if we don't use that, and now we have industrial farming, like what is that doing to us as a people? It was, it was fascinating, I think. Yeah.
I mean, it just brings us back to the land. It brings us back to the waters that flow. Ultimately, that's where we come from. That's where our healing always returns, with a bit of sparkle and spark from the skies, however we want to look at religion and mysticism. Yeah.
But it's ancient knowledge, it's ancient, and we have to keep uncovering it.
Yes. Yes. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming and helping to uncover some stories from the last century and to reach so far back and beyond and into the future.
Thank you for having me, Risa. It was great.
Thank you for listening to Knotwork Storytelling. Please subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform, and do share this episode with other lovers of myth and story. By the way, everyone is a lover of myth and story, even if they've forgotten. You can find out more about my writing, my book, my courses, and how to work with me as a coach, as well as my online community, The Heroine's Knot, at marisagowdy.com. Follow the show on Instagram at Knotwork Podcast, and join our listeners group on Facebook. Gratefully, I live, write, work, and record this podcast on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape tribe, whose name means original people. Remember, ancient stories are medicine for our modern maladies, and your stories can help heal the past, anchor us into the present, and create a more beautiful, sustainable future.